right, let's talk about rationality. First, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. So last week I was seeing final project check-ins, and some people were submitting PowerPoint presentations. Some were really excellent, but some fell for sort of this common trap, which is putting too much stuff on the slides. If you want a script to read from, I think that's kind of harder to do. It's hard to read a script and make it sound natural. But if you want to read something, print out that copy where all of the stuff is on the slides, but then make a version where you get rid of all the words on the slides. Because if there's too many words, people are going to be reading the slides and their brain isn't going to be hearing you. So there's going to be this disconnect, and it's going to be that much harder to give a good presentation. It's PowerPoint, not Power Paragraph. If you search YouTube for how to give good presentations, there will be a ton of excellent advice. So I definitely recommend ask YouTube for advice here. My big piece of advice is the better you are at presentations, the more opportunities you will have in your work life after graduation. If you're bad at giving presentations, people will tune out while you're talking and they won't take you as seriously, and your career will slow down compared to what it could be if you work on giving good presentations. So treat this final project as an opportunity to practice your presentations in a context where you're dealing with classmates and a professor rather than an employer or people who are dealing with money and higher stakes situations. Another piece of housekeeping, we've got the final exam coming up. My advice for this would be to go through the old assignments that we've been doing each week, print them out, watch my response videos to make sure that what you put in there makes sense. If you've been using ChatGPT for these, you're going to be at a big disadvantage. ChatGPT sometimes does a pretty decent job answering a question, and often that is a good way to wrap your head around the concepts, to get those explanations from ChatGPT, especially if there's anything you're uncertain about. Ask it to clarify things. It can be very useful. But if you're just copy pasting, you're going to be at a big disadvantage because sometimes it gets stuff wrong. Also, a minor point here, it's going to be a timed exam. So if you need accommodations, reach out to the Disability Services Center now so that I will be able to give you appropriate accommodations. All right, so let's talk about the reading. Some of this stuff is going to be, just kind of pointing at some interesting things that came up in the reading, maybe trying to tie it into the context of our class. But mostly Buchholz did, I think, a really good job of explaining the concepts here. I don't have a ton to add, but still worth, just summarizing, going through. So the big things he was talking about were rational expectations and behavioral economics. So rational expectations, I think, is interesting because it follows a similar sort of a theoretical move to what we saw in public choice theory. You look at a big, important economic literature and then look for where it's missing the economic way of thinking. Just be more rigorous and consistent in assuming that people, respond to incentives, or assuming that people have to deal with things from a particular perspective and they can't see things from the top down the way a theorist can. So in public choice theory, you're looking at especially Keynesian macroeconomic theory, which assumed that people would just do the right thing. And public choice theorists said, well, will they? And with rational expectations, you've got this idea of we, create a bunch of new money supply and then people just suddenly have new money. Rational expectations is asking, well, if the people in the economy studied economics, how would things be different? How would things be different if they anticipated things? So just as a point of how science advances, I think this is a really interesting case because it is just sort of taking something that came before it and being more thoroughly economic in its analysis. Excuse me. Another interesting thing that Buchholz brought up in this is there is this contradiction, especially in the strong version of, say, the efficient market hypothesis. The efficient market hypothesis makes a lot of sense except for the fact that it tells us we shouldn't put effort into making sure that the prices are right. And if none of us do that, then the prices will be purely random. So there is kind of this inherent tension, but there is this tendency towards, and I think Buchholz does a good job pointing out that in something like the stock market, that pressure towards the efficient market equilibrium is a lot stronger and faster than it would be for something like the impacts of fiscal policy. So if you look at something like Ricardian equivalence, there's a bigger gap between fiscal policy being decided and undertaken and eventually paid for down the line. And there's a lot of ways that people can just miss parts of that. So in practice, Ricardian equivalence is more of a theoretical curiosity. People tend not to save 100% in anticipation of the inevitable taxes to come later. Another thing to add to this is the efficient market hypothesis is tricky if we're assuming a lot of sort of mathematically rational actors. But in the real world, where we're boundedly rational, it's only natural that we're going to have different evaluations on things. So if you think about something like the share price of Microsoft, I might be more bullish on it than someone else is. And so there's room for them to voluntarily sell their shares to me, right? We can have a market. And with that market, we're able to sort of incorporate lots of different people's perspectives into the price. So one of the issues with rationality is as an assumption. Veblen talked about this very nicely, is this assumption of humanity as lightning calculators of pleasure and pain. It goes too far, right? But when we are boundedly rational, when we aren't lightning calculators of pleasure and pain, but instead we're just trying to deal with what we've got, do our best in our limited capacities, it makes the world richer and more complicated and more difficult to pin down, and rationality is going to be that much more difficult. Right? So you think something worth remembering is rationality doesn't necessarily mean you're right. It just means that you're sort of thinking through things in a particular way. And if the world is complex and has lots of moving parts, you can be rational but still be wrong. And so the rational expectations view of the world, with the caveat that people aren't these lightning calculators who are mathematically rational, those contradictions, those tensions become less of a constraint. They become sort of less of something that makes something like the efficient market hypothesis seem like a contradiction in terms. Another thing to bring up with rational expectations, so the business cycle equivalent or extension of rational expectations we call the real business cycle theory. And this is a view that recessions and booms happen because there is a fundamental change in the underlying economic reality, not that there is some miscoordination or that people didn't predict well enough. But it's worth pointing out that theory, sounds kind of weird in some ways, but really
I don't understand, but I'm learning new things every day.
Sorry, that thing doesn't work until it's inconvenient. Sorry. So when economists are thinking about business cycles, we have a bunch of different theories, but we don't have a finalized answer. Right? So any given recession, it's often very difficult to tell what type of a recession it is until it's too late. Is it a Keynesian recession where I'm not buying because you're not buying because I'm not buying? We might find that out, but we might find it out after the recession was over. Right? So there is a rational expectations theory of business cycles, and some recessions fit that, but it's hard to know if it will. All right, behavioral economics. The one thing I want to kind of just pick at here is the question from the written assignment. What are heuristics and biases? Heuristics are rules of thumb. Biases are ways that we get things wrong in kind of a consistent way. So if you think about bias, if I'm playing darts and say I have a shoulder injury, and as a result, I always shoot a little bit to the left of where I'm aiming, That's a bias, right? That's a physical bias. In terms of cognition and thinking through things, often we have biases like we're not good about thinking about time. Humans are also not great with particularly small or particularly large numbers. So behavioral economics have found a lot of cases where the way we look at things leads us in a particular direction, not necessarily towards the truth, what we would be looking at if we could sort of pull out our own psychology, but things that are maybe near the truth, but off in a certain direction. With heuristics, this is sort of a highfalutin word for rules of thumb. An example of a heuristic that we might follow is something like if you see a lot of people waiting in line in front of a restaurant, maybe it's a good restaurant, right? They're probably waiting in line for good reason. That's a heuristic we might call social proof. Seeing other people doing something allows us to economize on the hard effort of evaluating. So if you're, say, trying to figure out where do you go to lunch, you could look on Yelp and look at the reviews, but maybe you're worried that some of those reviews were purchased. Maybe they're not legitimate reviews, or maybe a competitor purchased bad reviews. So if you're not certain, you'd have to take a lot of time to dig through those reviews, evaluate them, and figure out, is it really a good place to go? Or you see there's a big line. There was a big line last week. There's a big line a year ago. It's probably pretty good. Let's just go. That rule of thumb allows you to save a lot of effort on thinking through something, which is a good transition to bounded rationality. So it's a lot simpler. There's sort of two situations that are easiest to model. One is where people are just purely random. They just flip a coin. And the far extreme on the other side is that people are fully mathematically rational. Neither of those are terribly realistic assumptions. That said, right, the non-bounded rationality models still do a pretty decent job. So that Milton Friedman point of it's about whether the model makes good predictions that counts. Often we see that even ridiculous assumptions can lead to a good model overall. I would add not just make good predictions, but also enhance our understanding. A nice argument in favor of bounded rationality comes from Milton Friedman's son, David Friedman. If you look for his price theory book, which you can find on his website, he gives this argument for if people are a little rational some of the times, it's going to be better to assume that they're fully rational because that's going to bias your model in the direction that they're going. So you contrast that with the idea of people just randomly doing things. What are they going to do if they randomly do things? Okay, that gives us one prediction. What are they going to do if they're fully rational? They're going to be over here. Okay, well, they're sometimes random, sometimes fully rational. So they're going to be somewhere in between. But assuming they're fully rational pulls you in the direction of where people are headed. Now, on the point of bounded rationality, it is hard to make a boundedly rational model of a human being. It's a lot easier to just say, here is sort of this mathematical version that pulls us directly in the right direction. We're going to assume that people optimize, that they use calculus, that they have this elaborate model of the world. It's hard if you don't already know calculus, but if you're an economist, you've had to learn a lot of calculus, you've had to learn a lot of math, and it is genuinely easier to make this mathematically intense model than a more realistic model with bounded rationality. That said, the idea of bounded rationality is really important, especially in the 21st century, because we have all this information coming at us constantly, and we have to evaluate it, but we just don't have enough time. We have to economize on our scarce attention, and therefore we just simply cannot be rational in sort of this traditional mathematical sense of the word. We are inherently boundedly rational, and we need to think hard as economists about how do we model that effectively. It has become easier to model in the last 30, 40 years as computation has become more accessible, as it's become cheaper, and as the models that we have access to have gotten better. A really interesting case of that, I have to read this paper, but this paper, Generative Agents, Interactive Simulacra of Human Behavior, Really tough title there. But this paper that I've got on my desk to read eventually, when I can catch my breath in August, uses ChatGPT as an underlying way to decide what different agents are going to do. So it sets up a little world with some imaginary people who interact with that world and with each other. What interactions do they do? Well, that's decided by the model underlying ChatGPT. That is not necessarily the best way to model people, but it is a way to model interactions between people who are relatively complicated agents, right? They aren't just randomly flipping a coin. They aren't just always doing the same thing, but they aren't perfectly rational either, right? ChatGPT is famously bad at some things, uh, including often math, right? You can ask ChatGPT to do math questions, and sometimes it knocks it out of the park, but sometimes it treats the number 3 as a symbol rather than as a quantity, and it can get things wrong as a result of that. That said, with computation, we have the options of things like agent-based modeling, where we have models of individual actions that are more complicated, but still not sort of as crystalline, as mathematically fully rational as the models became before. So computer simulations basically give us a low stakes place to try out these interactions. We'll take a look at a really interesting example in just a second. But there's also experimental economics. So we can run controlled experiments where we put real people into a setting and see what they actually do. So interesting figures here. Vernon Smith got the Nobel Prize a long time ago for introducing this field. Charles Holt is another interesting figure here. Colin Kammerer. I think one of you guys is doing a Colin Kammerer presentation. And there are some certain centers that do a lot of this sort of work. Vernon Smith is at Chapman University, so definitely they have a big center in this. Caltech, I think, is where Colin Kammerer is. They're kind of doing more technical neuroeconomics often. George Mason University has people working in this field. They also have people working in computational agent-based modeling economics. But with these experiments, right? So here's a nice simple example, the ultimatum game. So let's say I'm the economist running this experiment. I put person A and person B into a room and I say, hey, person A, here's $10. You offer a split to person B. If they accept your split, then you guys get that money. If they reject it, you get nothing. So the mathematically rational option would be to say, person 1, I will give you 1 cent, which is more than 0. And person 2 will look at that and they'll say, 1 cent is more than 0, I will take the offer. And what we would expect is that people put into this game will always try to offer as little as possible, and the other person will accept. But when we have real people play this for real money, very often people will turn down this offer. So if we look at this game tree here, on the right branch of this, there we go. On the right branch of this, oh, this is not going to work. The person offering this, let me get myself out of the way. Player 1 is offering to keep 8 for themselves and give $2 to the other person. Well, $2 is better than $0. But in practice, people tend to reject offers where they aren't getting at least a third of this. A 50-50 offer everyone accepts, but 8 is better than 5. We would think person 1 would offer this, and 2 is better than 0. We would think person 2 would accept this. But if person 2 rejects it, they both get nothing. And in practice, people tend to do that. Now, is that irrational? In some sense it is, but it's also kind of a reflection of the psychological constraints that we have. Some of the bounds on our rationality include sense of fairness, right? So something might look rational, but if it's unfair, then it's not the money that's the full thing we're getting. We're getting money plus utility, and we get less utility from the unfair outcome to the point where we might be willing to forego the money to avoid the unfairness. And that's one particular example of kind of unexpected result, kind of unexpected to economists, expected to non-economists result from this nice simple game. There's a lot of really interesting stuff there. And you can build up more elaborate games to understand more complicated scenarios. And then computational economics, I think, is something that is we don't talk about enough. I think this is a field of economics that I expect to grow a lot over the next 100 years, and I think we're kind of dragging our feet on getting into it because it takes a lot of work to start this up, and I certainly have felt that myself. I've been trying to move my personal research agenda in this direction, but it's just really hard to do to get off the ground. That said, some interesting figures here. Robert Axelrod, who is someone underlying the model we're about to look at. The Santa Fe Institute does a lot of work in this vein. Lee Tesfazian is an economist at the University of Iowa who has a lot of helpful resources on this. There's a lot of interesting figures here, but let me walk you through. I brought up this simulation a lot, but let me just walk you through it a little bit. So the evolution of trust. This is by Nicky Case. This is sort of a visualization of this concept Bob Axelrod sort of started to undertake in the 80s. So if we look at a historical case, right, when peace broke out during trench warfare in World War I, you had this context where you had enemy sides peacefully interacting with each other for Christmas, playing soccer in no man's land. And the question is, when they're supposed to be killing each other, how are they able to overcome that and trust each other enough that they get into no man's land, make themselves easy targets, and interact cooperatively with these people who are supposed to be their enemy? More broadly, if we think about how do we get civilization, period, we always have this incentive to hit the other guy over the head with a rock and take his stuff. How do we get to a point where we cooperate? So the prisoner's dilemma is the underlying game for this, but basically it boils down to I can cooperate or I can cheat. So if I cheat, I do the negative thing, and they also cheat, okay, we get nothing. What if I cheat again, but they cooperate? I get a big benefit for that. So we have this situation where we would like to both cooperate, but each of us has an incentive to cheat. And so we expect to be in this result where we don't get civilization, where we can't have this peaceful soccer game in between the trenches. We expect a bad outcome. But when we repeatedly interact, things turn out a little bit differently, right? So here, hey, we got a good outcome, me and this imaginary agent. If we do it again, we can keep getting that. So in this case, hey, we keep getting it. Now, if I were to cheat, I might be able to get a short-run benefit. Look at this, I'm getting extra from them. But how are they likely to interact in the future? Well, they're probably going to expect that I'm going to cheat, and they're going to be less willing, and then our cooperation erodes. We're no longer getting the cooperative outcome. So if we can keep being cooperative, we can keep getting larger and larger payoffs. But this requires a certain amount of trust, and it requires building trust. But we're able to build trust when we're interacting over time. So I'm going to skip to the next one in just a second. So with agent-based modeling, the way we do this, and this was Bob Axelrod's project back in the early 80s, was to say, let's create a tournament where different strategies play the prisoner's dilemma. So a strategy is basically a set of rules to decide, will you cheat or will you cooperate in this particular game? So one strategy would be always cooperate. Another strategy would be never cooperate. And you can get a little bit more elaborate, but the strategy that ended up winning was what they're calling copycat here, what was called tit for tat in that tournament. The idea there is rather than always cheat or always cooperate, you look at what the other person's doing, and if they're cooperative, you behave cooperatively. If they're not cooperative, you don't behave cooperatively so that you avoid the chance of being taken advantage of. Right? So that in and of itself gives us this situation where we can understand that it's not what you do, but how you interact. So in that case, it was tit for tat that won that first contest. And that gave us a lot of insight into how do we get cooperation, right? So a key ingredient is interaction, but we're also getting a model of bounded rationality. These strategies are not thinking about what is optimal. They're just setting rules, and then we can see what rules actually survive. Really interesting version of this that takes us a step further was Christian Lindgren. Let me find this paper on Google Scholar. Christian Lindgren set up the model in a way where these strategies could evolve over time. I think this is the one. The strategies could evolve over time, and the result was you ended up with not just, what's the best strategy, but the best strategy changes as the game gets played and as different strategies evolve or die off. This isn't the paper I'm looking for, but if you're interested, ping me on Discord and I'll find a link and get it to you. So, all this said, here we go, evolution. All of this said, with computer models, we're able to set up something that simplifies reality in a way where we can better understand important concepts like cooperation. So let's close on this thought. So in this chapter, we saw a lot of interesting stuff on sort of two extremes of rationality. Rational expectations, where we're modeling people as very rational, and behavioral economics, where we're seeing that people often are irrational. Going forward, what do we do with that? Well, as economists, we want to build up our understanding of how to model bounded rationality. Two interesting ways forward on that: experimental economics, where we put real people into constrained situations and see how they respond, and computational economics, where we set up imaginary people, let them interact, and see what comes out of those interactions. All right, lots and lots of interesting stuff here. We'll leave it at that. If you got questions on this, or you want to learn about where to go forward to learn more stuff after the end of the semester, I'm of course happy to oblige you. Just let me know in the usual places, and I will talk to you in the future.